Assassination attempts on U.S. presidents, a sobering history. The office of the President of the United States, the most powerful political position in the world, has unfortunately been the target of numerous assassination attempts throughout history. From the early 19th century to the present day, incumbent, former, and even president-elects have faced the threat of deadly violence from those intent on cutting short the lives and tenures of America's commanders-in-chief. This video will provide a somber look at the various assassinations and assassination attempts that have taken place against U.S. presidents over the centuries. On January 30th, 1835, a man named Richard Lawrence approached President Jackson outside the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and attempted to shoot him at close range. Remarkably, both of Lawrence's pistols misfired, and Jackson was unharmed. Historical accounts describe Lawrence as a lunatic who later described himself as heir to the British crown, providing a glimpse into the deranged motivations behind this attack. In February 1861, as President-elect Lincoln was traveling to his inauguration, he faced threats of the so-called Baltimore Plot, an alleged conspiracy by Confederate sympathizers to assassinate him en route. Despite debates over the reality of this threat, Lincoln and his advisors took extensive precautions, with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency playing a crucial role in managing his security. Later, in August 1864, while riding unguarded from the White House to the soldier's home, Lincoln narrowly survived a rifle shot that passed just inches from his head, piercing his hat. This incident underscored the vulnerability of the president, even in relatively mundane circumstances. Just days before his eventual assassination, Lincoln faced another close call. In his final public address on April 11, 1865, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, attended the speech with the intention of shooting the president. However, Booth's co-conspirator, Lewis Powell, ultimately decided against the attempt due to the size of the crowd. Tragically, Booth's plan came to fruition 3 days later, when he fatally shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This devastating event not only claimed the life of the revered president, but also set in motion a series of related plots to kill other government leaders that night. In 1881, President James Garfield was shot by Charles J. Guiteau at a train station in Washington. Historical evidence suggests that Garfield could have potentially survived the gunshot wounds, but his doctors mishandled the case, and he ultimately died from complications in September of that year. In 1901, President William McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley succumbed to his injuries 8 days later, dying from gangrene. In 1909, President William Taft and Mexican President Porfirio Diaz held a historic summit meeting in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, the first time a U.S. president had crossed the border. However, this event was marred by serious security concerns, including an assassination plot that was foiled just feet away from the two leaders. In 1910, President Taft received a threatening warning about an alleged plot in Boston, Massachusetts, though the culprit was never identified. Theodore Roosevelt, running for president again in 1912 after serving as commander-in-chief, was shot and wounded by an assailant while campaigning in Milwaukee, though he insisted on delivering his speech with the bullet still lodged in his chest. In 1928, President-elect Herbert Hoover narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by Argentine anarchists while traveling through the Andes Mountains, with the plotters arrested before they could plant explosives. The attempts continued in more recent history, such as the 1933 attack on President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt in Miami, which claimed the life of Chicago Mayor Anton Kermack instead. On November 1, 1950, while President Harry Truman was temporarily residing at Blair House during White House renovations, a group of Puerto Rican nationalists launched a brazen attack in an attempt to kill him. In the ensuing confrontation, White House police officer Leslie Caulfield was mortally wounded, but he was able to kill one of the would-be assassins, Griselio Torresola, before he could enter the residence. The other assailant, Oscar Collazo, was also stopped before reaching the president. This attack underscores the constant need for vigilance in protecting the safety of our nation's leaders, even in the most secure of locations. Just a decade later, on December 11, 1960, Richard Paul Pavlik hatched a plot to crash his car, loaded with dynamite, into the vehicle carrying President-elect John F. Kennedy. However, Pavlik's resolve faltered when he saw Kennedy's wife and children with him, and he ultimately decided not to carry out the attack at that time. Though Pavlik remained intent on executing his plan, he was arrested before he could make another attempt, narrowly averting what could have been a devastating tragedy. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, remains one of the most shocking and impactful events in American history. As Kennedy rode in a motorcade, he was fatally shot, while Texas Governor John Connally was also wounded. The suspected assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was later killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby while in police custody. A subsequent investigation by the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald was the lone gunman responsible. Just 5 years later, in 1968, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy was gunned down in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, shortly after winning the California primary. This murder, coming only 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., pushed the Democratic Party into a deep crisis during its tumultuous political convention that summer. The violence continued in 1972, when presidential candidate George Wallace was shot and paralyzed by Arthur Bremer in Laurel, Maryland. Bremer had previously sought to target President Richard Nixon, though he was unable to get close enough. In 1974, Samuel Bick went so far as to hijack a DC-9 aircraft, intending to crash it into the White House to kill President Nixon. However, he was fatally shot by police before the plane could take off from the Baltimore-Washington International Airport. The attacks on President Gerald Ford in 1975 by Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore, while unsuccessful, served as another grim reminder of the dangers faced by America's leaders. Fromm's gun misfired, while Moore's shot missed its mark. The presidency of Jimmy Carter was also marked by its share of alarming assassination attempts and plots. On May 5, 1979, just before Carter was scheduled to give a speech in Los Angeles, the Secret Service arrested a man named Raymond Lee Harvey. Harvey, an unemployed drifter with a history of mental illness, was found carrying a starter pistol loaded with blank rounds. According to Harvey, he had been part of a 4-man operation to assassinate the president, claiming he had test-fired the weapon the night before on a hotel rooftop. March 30, 1981. John Hinckley Jr. shoots President Ronald Reagan as he exits the Hilton Hotel in Washington, seriously wounding the president. Press Secretary James Brady is wounded as well. His death 33 years later would be ruled a homicide. Hinckley had stalked President Jimmy Carter in October 1980, but didn't do anything at that point. 1993. A plot to blow up President George H.W. Bush by car bomb is foiled in Kuwait. The assassins were in the employ of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. 1994. Bill Clinton, 42nd president. Clinton was inside the White House when Francisco Martin Duran fired at the building using a semi-automatic rifle. Clinton was unharmed. Duran was convicted of attempting to assassinate the president and sentenced to 40 years in prison. 2005, George W. Bush, 43rd president. Bush was attending a rally in Tbilisi with Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili when a man named Vladimir Arutyunian threw a hand grenade towards the podium. It did not explode, and no one was hurt. Arutyunian was sentenced to life in prison. November 11, 2011, Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez fires multiple shots at the White House, striking the building but not injuring any members of President Barack Obama's family or anyone else. The threats have also extended to former presidents, as evidenced by the shooting attack on Donald Trump in July 2024. During a rally in Pennsylvania, Trump was wounded, while one attendee was killed. The shooter, Thomas Matthew Crooks, was killed by the Secret Service. In the days prior to this attack, authorities had also uncovered a separate plot by a Pakistani man named Asif Merchant, allegedly an agent of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who had paid $5,000 to undercover federal agents to assassinate Trump in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And just 2 months later, in September 2024, a man named Ryan Wesley Ruth was spotted on a private golf course in Florida with an SKS-style rifle, apparently aiming at a location where Trump was known to golf. Routh fled the scene after being shot at by a Secret Service agent, but was ultimately apprehended without incident. These recent incidents demonstrate that the threats against the American presidency remain ever present, with both domestic and international actors seeking to target current and former commanders-in-chief. They underscore the critical importance of maintaining robust security measures and intelligence-gathering efforts to safeguard those entrusted with our nation's highest office.